And we are very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Shailly Gupta Barnes, who is the policy director at the Kairos Center and with the Poor People's Campaign. Shailly, thank you for sticking with us. Really happy to have you here on the show.
Yes, thank you. This has been a really amazing conversation to join in today.
No, well, we're super happy to have you here, and the thought that brought me to really want to bring you on and pick your brain a little bit was these stats that came out earlier this year. Lord, this is what the internet has done to my mind. Earlier this week, that poverty went down, at least according to one government measure, in the United States because of the impact of the relief programs. And I guess I was of two minds when I saw that, Shailly. I mean, one, I'm always happy to hear that there's a possibility that poverty went down. Then on the second hand, I thought, but do we undercount poverty, and what does this really mean? So, when you saw this story and everything that's come out of it about sort of the state of poor people in America, what are some of your reflections there?
Yeah, I think there are, three different pieces of this news that to pay attention to. One was, what definition were they using? There were two definitions that came out in the census report on poverty this year, as it always does. And the official poverty measure went up. It actually went up by 1%. And that measure only looks at the income. So how are households doing just based on their income? And that measure went up. So more people, according to that, if you just looked at income, fell below the poverty line in 2020. The second measure, which is the supplemental poverty measure, which accounts both for income, but also for government payments and programs, that's the number that shows that the poverty rate went down by 2.5%. And so this is what I think the biggest news is that when you account for especially the stimulus payments, which this measure does, the number of people living below the poverty threshold in 2020 went down. Government programs, giving people money can reduce poverty. So that's the first thing I would pay attention to. The second is, you raise this issue, is the underreporting. There was the census, because of the pandemic and everything, there was some underreporting for low income households. So the numbers are a little bit, the downward pressure may be overestimated by these reports, but that's, it's still important to see that government programs did have this effect. And the third point I would say is, if you look at the programs that had kind of the greatest impacts, it was new programs and greatly expanded programs. So Social Security always is one of the most successful anti-poverty programs in the country. And what the census report shows is that these stimulus payments kept over 11 million people above the poverty line. And the expanded unemployment insurance from the pandemic era kept another 5.5 million people above the poverty line. The stimulus was obviously new, and the expansion of unemployment was historic. And so, maybe what we actually have to learn from this is, yes, government programs work, but new and expanded government programs work a lot better. And the other thing I would say,
yeah, please.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, the other thing I would say is, in the Poor People's Campaign, we always look at the people who are living right above that threshold. And so the threshold itself is very low. And if you look at right above it, then you have, before the pandemic, 140 million people who are poor or just one emergency away from economic ruin. What this report shows is that number has also gone down, again, due to these new and expanded programs. So, the lesson is, that we need, that poverty government programs do work, but expanded and new programs work better and maybe more effectively than not having those programs. And I think those are the lessons we got to pull out of this report right now.
No, I think that's critically important. I mean, and it's, I don't even know where I actually first heard this. Maybe I heard it from you, Shailly, but I've been thinking about this phrase that poverty is a policy choice. I mean, this is not something that is just natural and innate. And it does feel like this entire period of the pandemic and the rescue programs, the relief programs, expanding certain programs is sort of ideologically very important too, because it seems to have just sort of blown past this whole idea, I mean, even though it's still out there, of course, of the old how you gonna pay for it question in terms of what's really possible.
This is yes, for sure. So this whole $3.5 trillion debate that's going back and forth right now on the budget resolution, or the 1 trillion on this bipartisan framework. This is we have more than enough to address all of the social injustices that this country faces. And poverty is a policy choice. And actually, with moral and just policies, we can end the moral injustice of poverty. And $3.5 trillion over 10 years is really not a lot of money. It's just over 1% of our economic output over the next decade. So that's $280 trillion we're talking about. $3.5 trillion is barely over 1% of that. And we have spent over the past 2 decades, $21 trillion for prison, for policing, and for war. Money is not the issue. It's a political will to determine that, housing, hunger, healthcare, paid leave, making sure we live in safe and thriving communities, that these are our national priorities. If we can summon the political will to move towards poverty, towards systemic racism, towards climate change, the resources will follow.
Can you repeat that 21 trillion figure? That kind of blew me away.
It's pretty incredible. This is from a report that the National Priorities Project put out recently. But basically, over the last 2 decades, over the last 20 years, we have spent $21 trillion on war, prisons, and policing. And so this money we could have had a new electric grid. We could have had millions of $15 an hour jobs. We could have, had the child tax credit, which has proven to be another one of these, really effective anti-poverty programs, extended for a number of years, in terms of childhood education, caregiving. That $21 trillion could have gone many different ways. And what it shows, though, that the resources exist where the political will does. And so let's summon the political will, and the resources will follow.
I think
in a way, it's kind of like, no, well, I was just going to make a comment. Like, in a way, it's kind of like, yes, we should tax the rich, obviously, but like we already have a lot of resources. It's just how we're allocating it.
Yeah, and taxing the rich. I mean, there are many different ways that needs to happen. One of the things that's missing from the negotiations that are going on right now is actually taxing or taking away the subsidies and credits for the fossil fuel industry. So if you think about what are the contributing factors to the conditions we're facing today, let's do something about that. And so there are many different mechanisms that we can use to raise and meet this, what they call a tax gap. There's hundreds of billions of dollars that is not being collected through tax revenue. And it's no surprise that the top 1% is the biggest, it represents the largest tax evading group of that, some $170 billion that could be collected every year from taxing the rich better.
Yeah, I read a wild study a couple months back that you're more likely to be audited if you get the earned income tax credit than if you make over $500,000. I think that was the threshold. Either way, it was something that just totally blew me away. But it makes sense because really rich people have all these ways to evade, I guess I can't say that, I don't want to avoid taxes. And so it's complex, you got to go looking for it. But obviously someone who is just a regular person, it's relatively easier, so that's where the resources go. But moving the ball slightly forward here, Shailly, I mean, I know, and especially talking about the issue of Congress, but also how we view this moment. I mean, I know one of the things that Poor People's Campaign has really been putting out is this concept of a third Reconstruction. I know there was the bill that was introduced with Barbara Lee that goes to that. But I mean, it really does feel in many ways, I think it's become almost, we've become so desensitized to the moment, but given the breadth and the depth of the crisis the pandemic has brought on, it does feel like this is also an inflection point moment in terms of how we look at, where we're going in the future, and also how we position the whatever you want to call them, legislative choices, policy choices, the moral and human choices in front of us.
I think that's right. I mean, we're in the throes of multiple interlocking crises that were bad before the pandemic and have since gotten worse. These government programs that have been effective, they've lifted the load slightly, but many of us are still crushed by household debt, by medical debt, by not being able to put food on our tables for our children and our families in a regular and sustainable way. And this $3.5 trillion is a compromise. It's a compromise on all of these needs. And what, I think I think what really we need to pay attention to is how we got to this position to begin with. I mean, there are 64 million low-income voters in the country. All right, 34 million of them voted in 2016, or 29 million. I'm getting that. Well, so close to 30 million of these voters did not vote in 2016, and that they did turn out in 2020 through targeted organizing. I know the Poor People's Campaign targeted over 2.5 million low-income voters in the lead up to the 2020 elections. And they shifted the calculus in key states. And that's how we end up in this position where, through this process of reconciliation, the slim majority that was eked out can be even thinking about passing something like a $3.5 trillion stimulus or budget resolution. And so, but this is if this passes in whatever form it does, it's such a slim, it's by a hair. And then possibly, depends on what happens, in 2022 or 2024, any of these gains could be upended. And so that is just not what we can fight for. That's not what we're organizing for. And so this is really, it's less about $3.5 trillion and more about shifting the entire orientation of our government and economy. And that is the basis of the third Reconstruction. Because when you center the people, who have been hurt most by at least 40 years of neoliberal reforms and policies that have shredded the social safety net, undermined labor, that have deregulated financial industry and the banks, and paved the way for this historic inequality. Then what the solution to that is to prioritize the people who have been most harmed by that. So yes, we need this legislation, we need this $3.5 trillion, and we also need a real political agenda that speaks to the needs of the poor. And so, if we, the way that we see coming out of this moment is to throw down hard, throw down now for the poor, with the poor, tax the rich, organize the poor. That's the only way that we're going to not only save our democracy, but rebuild this economy on the right basis moving forward.
One thing I just also want to raise here too, and something that I've always appreciated from the Poor People's Campaign is sort of the way morality is injected into a lot of these conversations, which I think, sometimes people may be a little so on, but it feels to me that that's an important ideological piece of this, because the poor are always cast in such negative moral terms. I mean, the whole idea of lift yourself up by your bootstraps, what do these people do? Cultures of dependency. I mean, all these things that are often sort of trotted out as why to never do anything for people who are living in poverty. But, the same is never applied. I thought the point you just made about $3.5 trillion being a compromise, which I agree with, in and of itself seems to speak to that there's so much intransigence against this, especially and maybe almost exclusively from the ruling elites in the country. I mean, it does seem profoundly like a moral crisis in the so-called maybe self-appointed leadership of the country.
It is, and I appreciate this turn to the moral framing. I mean, the underlying narrative around all of these compromises on the backs of the poor, are that people have to prove their worthiness of being better. So poverty is the fault of the poor. And connected to that, are these other narratives about job creators and makers and takers and this whole kind of thing. But if we looked at what happened again in the pandemic, at the height of the pandemic era unemployment programs, when those were being implemented, low-wage workers in particular, I want to focus on that group for a minute, because that's who conservatives and, even some of our Democrats are talking about. These workers were eligible to get up to $600 per week. That's about the equivalent of $15 an hour for a 40-hour week. That's, when minimum wage is $7.25 and tipped wages are around $2 an hour. Yes. So this, people are getting more than what they were, more through these stimulus programs than they were at work. And the fact is that extra money was keeping millions of jobs in the economy. The Economic Policy Institute estimated at one point that those unemployment payments were keeping 5 million jobs in the economy. And so, every dollar that goes to minimum wage gets multiplied into $1.20. Every dollar of SNAP or food stamps gets multiplied into that or more. Whereas every dollar that goes into a business turns into less than that. It's just inefficient. So this, again, is not the prevailing narrative. If we can flip it to actually say that, these big employers and corporations, they're the takers, and the workers, the low-wage workers, they are the makers. They are the wealth creators in this country. And so To this argument about, that we see that conservatives have been making, that we had to cut these benefits to get people back to work. In every single one of those states, the recovery was slower than in places that maintained those benefits as long as they could. So, when we talk about moral policy, when we talk about centering those who are at the heart of these crises, it's not only because it's the right thing to do, but it's because moral policy is also good economics. I mean, this is the direction we need to go. And, we've seen that over and over through the pandemic. And our challenge, I think, is to carry those lessons forward to the next, not just this next election cycle, but to this next kind of phase of where this country is going to go.
Well, Shailly, for those who are looking and maybe want to help move things forward, I know you all are doing a lot in terms of research and action at Kairos and the Poor People's Campaign. Where should they be looking?
Yeah, they should be going to the poorpeoplescampaign.org. We're organized in 45 states across the country with coordinating committees in your state. So if you go to our website, you can look up your committee and jump right in. We're organizing, many different things leading up to next June 2022. And really driving all of our attention to organizing poor and low-income people to command, and summon the political will we need right now.
Mm-hmm. Well, Shailly Gupta Barnes, the policy director at the Kairos Center and the Poor People's Campaign, really, really happy you were able to join us. And thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Absolutely. Pleasure was all ours.